Welcome to The Chairlift, the podcast where we talk all things snowboarding. I'm your host, Snowboard Mom, snowboarder for 28 years, previous competitor, snowboard judge, and most recently, mom and volunteer at my Grom's snowboard competitions. Today on the show, I'm doing a solo episode so that you will all be introduced to yours truly. So what is my actual name? My name is Marie-France Noël, so very similar to the snowboarder that you all know and love, Marie-France Roy, MFR. We have the same first name. So I started snowboarding and don't count the years here, but I was about 12 or 13 years old when I finally got my first snowboard. So funny thing here, I wanted a snowboard so badly because one of my friends' cool older brother was snowboarding at the time, and Christmas and my birthday were right around the corner, and for Christmas that year, I received a pair of skis. Yep, I cried. I cried so much. It was the biggest disappointment, and I still skied quite a bit that year, but let me tell you, was it ever way more special when the next year, when I was 13 years old, finally got my own snowboard. And back then, my parents didn't know a thing about snowboarding, and so they went to Sport Expert, which is just a general sporting store, not a specialized store in snowboarding, and bought one snowboards. Now, I never saw another one snowboards other than the one snowboard that I got. And I also got a no-name pair of snowboard boots that were way oversized. So back then, my parents, as I was still growing, thought, let's buy her a pair of snowboard boots that are 2 sizes too big. And of course, being 13 years old, and a female who stops growing at about 13 years old, my feet never grew into those boots, and I had horrible heel lift. So immediately when I got snowboarding, I was hooked, and I gravitated towards every little side hit that my local ski hill had. Of course, they did not have a snowboard park at the ski hill that I rode at. So I rode in the Ottawa area, and my parents would buy a season pass at the ski hill that had the cheapest season pass, and that was Mont Cascade. I had a wonderful time snowboarding there until, of course, we had a family trip to Mont Tremblant. And that is where I started to discover some real snowboard parks and started hitting jumps and really looking up to some of the local pros in the area, which strangely enough, would include the crew of snowboarders that probably my husband's snowboard dad hung around with. So I also remembered people like Andrew Burns from the area, John Conway. And so shortly after, I was introduced to competitive snowboarding through the EQ snow jams that would run through the province of Quebec. So let me tell you about these EQ snow jams. Basically, there were always a few ladies competing, but back then the jumps really weren't always perfectly built. And I seem to recall that at every event there was at some point in time a major injury and someone being pulled off on a stretcher and towed away in the ambulance. So it definitely was a different time, and certainly skills as well as terrain parks were of a different caliber. So I recall this one EQ snow jam that took place at Mont Ste. Marie that was on one of the side runs. And mind you, these event organizers can only use what the ski hill offers to them. So they had this tiny narrow run to build two massive jumps. The jumps were built in a little bit of a turning point in the run, and one of the jumps was pointing towards the side of the run. Well, essentially, I decided to try both jumps during the practice, and when I tried that one jump pointing towards the forest, I landed, but I didn't brake soon enough and essentially ended up in the trees where there were giant snowmaking boulders. Ended up with this massive Charlie horse on the side of my thigh that went basically from my butt all the way down to my knee. Let me tell you, I still have scar tissue on my thigh from that crash nearly 25 years ago. This is just to say all of the work that some of the local shops put in to create a little bit of a snowboard community within the area. And forever, I will be grateful to those small shops putting in the effort to build that snowboard community. Now, of course, I also competed in halfpipe. I also want to say there was no local halfpipe in those years when I rode, but I was introduced to halfpipe in Mont Tremblant, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Back then, Mont Tremblant had a 14-foot halfpipe, and it was the perfect way to be introduced to transitions. Unfortunately, over the years, what happened is that many of the ski hills upgraded to a 19-foot halfpipe, and then eventually the 21 or 22-foot super pipe was introduced. And essentially, that made it very inaccessible for some of the ski hills to create a halfpipe that large. And therefore, many of the ski hills basically said, if we can't have something that is, permeable to competitive snowboarding and skiing, we may as well just not build it. And so slowly but surely, many of the ski hills unfortunately got rid of their halfpipe. So, looking back during those years, 2001, around that year is when I started competing. And I competed with the provincial association, which was called SNQ back then in Quebec. When you did those provincial association competitions, you would get ISF points, which is essentially the International Snowboard Federation. That was the federation that was built before FIS took over snowboarding. So yeah, I competed for a while doing, provincial ISF competitions. I started doing some bigger contests and ended up on the podium at provincials, got invited to nationals, but unfortunately my parents simply didn't have the financial means to send me out west and compete at nationals. So instead of going out west and paying for a plane ticket, my parents told me that if I found an event nearby, that they would take me to it. So, of course, I found a Grand Prix event in the eastern United States that my parents could drive me to. And that event was a Grand Prix in Sunday River, Maine. So off we went to Sunday River, which was about an 8-hour drive. And that year they had so much snow in Maine. I remember the snowbanks being almost as high as or as tall as our car. So we got to Sunday River. On practice day, I realized that I was going to be competing alongside Kelly Clark, Rob Kingwill, as well as Ross Powers. So here were my idols standing right beside me in a contest. And of course, I ended up with a really great score. I ended up on the podium that day, which allowed me to get enough points to do some bigger events the years after. So that was a really great milestone for 16-year-old me. And then eventually I was invited to do FIS World Cup events in Stoneham for a few years in a row, as well as podium at some of the NORAM Cups, and place really well at nationals. Unfortunately, there were some nationals where I was injured. I had some really bad ankle sprains and eventually ended up with ankle surgery because of such severe ankle sprains, probably due to boots being too big. Had a wonderful time doing that. And in the time that I was doing competitive snowboarding, I got to make so many friends, as well as learn the discipline of being an athlete. And that was, tremendously helpful for me. So eventually I was at the age where I had completed high school. I was ready to go to university, but to be honest, I had the competitive snowboarding bug. During those years when I was done high school were the years when Super Park was being hosted in Lake Louise, Alberta. The year after, I believe the second Super Park took place in Alberta, I decided to pack my bags and move to Lake Louise for the following season. To my wonderful surprise, the year that I showed up in Lake Louise, they decided to get rid of their halfpipe. That's right. Wow, am I ever lucky, right? Not only that, but essentially, my parents had told me that I was on my own in terms of competitive snowboarding, and it was pretty clear to me that if I wanted to pursue it, I had to do it through my own means. So in those years where I was competing, I had a few shop sponsorships. So shout out to EQ who sponsored me after I had completed that NORAM. And then later, many of the EQ shops closed down. And I moved to the Montreal area to go to university. And during those years, I was riding Mont Saint-Sauveur. And eventually, one of the employees from the Adrenaline shop in the South Shore approached me for a shop sponsorship there, as well as one of the local reps for Roxy Quicksilver had given me a product sponsorship with Roxy. So I had some wonderful time during those years. Mind you, they were also really difficult years for female snowboarders. I can't tell you the number of times where I was told that there was no women's category, or simply told that I wasn't allowed to compete because I was a girl, or that I simply had to compete against the guys, or that I would be the forerunner, or that, sure, there was a girls' category, but no prizes and no cash purse, while the boys, or the men, or the guys, were receiving, first place, getting some $2,000, which was not a insignificant amount at that time. They were at that event. Meanwhile, little boys, such as back then Sébastien Toutat, also known as Seb Toots, at the mere age of, I believe he was around 12, won the Empire Shakedown. I want to say we've come a very long way in women's snowboarding. During those years, I also recall Marie-France Roy doing the Axis slopestyle and landing a 900 at the slopestyle, and her asking me all about the US Open. The next year, I believe she went to the US Open and got recognized for her talent. Now, flash forward to when I lived in Lake Louise, near Banff, Alberta. I had a great time those years. I worked at the restaurant in the evenings and I got to ride all day. I also studied through distance education before that was all the rage. So remember, this was nearly 20 years before COVID-19. The sad part is that at that point in time, there were not really any contests, or just one or two contests taking place in Lake Louise. That pretty much ended my snowboard career, since I didn't have the financial means to travel in order to keep up with the contest scene. And my parents didn't have the financial means to, make me travel all over the place to compete in snowboarding. Nonetheless, my early 20s were wonderful, living near Banff in Lake Louise, as well as in Field, BC, essentially being a snowboard bum during the day, studying part-time through distance education, and working at the restaurant. I got to experience the powder, the backcountry, the summers of hiking, the lack of warmth during the summer, and a time that I will never forget. I absolutely recommend to any young person out there to take a gap year from studying, or to study through distance so that you can explore the world. So eventually I completed most of my studies, dated a guy that just was not for me, and moved back home with my parents when I was offered a job in the field that I loved, which is wildlife conservation. So I moved back home, and, moving from out west, being so spoiled with the powder, the grandiose terrain in my backyard, that I simply was not inspired to go back and ride Mont Tremblant or the local ski hill such as Mont Cascade again. So I took a few years where I probably only rode 2 or 3 days per winter, while all of my previous seasons had, over 60 days, some of which had over 100 days. So that was a really big change, but it gave me the opportunity to concentrate on my career. One day, as I decided to just go ride with my family in Mont Tremblant, of course, Mont Tremblant still had a half pipe, I met Snowboard Dad. That day in the halfpipe, I remember Charles Reed hitting the 19-foot pipe in Mont Tremblant, as well as myself. And I was just boasting out of the pipe that day. I'm guessing I felt inspired. And of course, my husband stood at the bottom of the pipe and simply clapped as I rode to the bottom. A week later, I happened to go riding in Mont Tremblant again. And as I passed him through a random run, I simply waved, and he waved back. And at the end of the run, we caught up, and he asked, "Hey, you want to come and do a run with us?" I said, "Sure, but I'm supposed to meet my parents for lunchtime." That is where the love story began. Of course, he also invited me to the hot tub at the end of an awesome day of riding. Now, I had no idea at that point in time that we would ever date, but I found this guy, Snowboard Dad, on Facebook, sent him a message and said, "Hey, if you ever want to go riding again, just message me." And of course, he messaged me a few weeks later saying, "Hey, my friend's having a party. There's a hot tub." So off I went to the hot tub once again with Snowboard Dad. Fast forward a few years, I ended up doing all sorts of stuff with Snowboard Dad, as he also had a wakeboard boat, and I was introduced to wake surfing. Back then, there was a wake surf event that was hosted nearby, near Calabogie, and so I trained and ended up winning the amateur division at the wake surf competition and was invited to the World Championships. So I went to the World Championships a few times in wake surfing as well. And I should also mention, during those years, I loved wakeboarding. However, wakeboarding was so hard on the body that I tore my ACL twice wakeboarding and had reconstructive surgery. Now, during those years, I also had my first baby, Ollie, who, as you know, is now 11 years old and competing in border cross mostly. And sometimes when he feels like it, we can get him in a freestyle contest. And then in 2016, I gave birth to Kai. Now, before I gave birth to those two, I was also a snowboard judge. So even though I had resolved to no longer competing, I decided to give back to snowboarding by becoming a snowboard judge. I didn't do that for very long because, of course, I got a family, I got busy, and next thing I knew, my own kids were competing in all of these snowboard events. So my kids have now been competing at Snowboard Quebec events for at least 3 years, and they are doing amazing. I am so proud of them, but seeing them compete at these provincial association events is like a full circle experience for me. For example, the provincial championships have been held at Mont Orignal for, I want to say, over 20 years now. And that is amazing. I remember going to the provincial championships in Mont Orignal and landing on the podium there. And now I get to see my own children go to the provincial championships at the very same resort, Mont Orignal. But last year it was my son Ollie who ended up on the podium for the border cross event, as well as my little guy Kai ending up on the podium in the border cross event. Now, one thing that is different from when I used to compete is that these days, thankfully, they have different age categories. It provides the opportunity for kids of all ages to be introduced to competition as well as learn how to become a competitive athlete. Okay, I'm gonna leave it here for now on my bio. So I do want to tell you about our latest contest that we did over the weekend. We brought our Groms to Bromont to do the Quebec Snowboard Yeti event. It was a wonderful setup. Let me tell you, the Bromont park crew really made something amazing with their park there. They had probably half a dozen sizable jumps as well as a beautiful set of rails. I mean, you had rails everywhere. There were just so many different options for the riders to take, and there were different skill levels, setups. I encourage you to check it out. So in the past 2 weeks, Bromont has been really lucky. They have received a lot more snow than the rest of Quebec. And while we were there, they received more snow than they had anticipated. So we got, a little bit of fresh snow slashed while we were there, on top of being at the Yeti event, which, by the way, is an event mostly for Groms that are under the age of 13. There is also an open event, but if you have some Groms or teenaged snowboarders or even adult competitors, I would encourage you to do the Quebecs, while for Grom-aged categories, they have a course adapted for them in the Yeti series. So Bromont has a really great selection of runs. Unfortunately, the one thing that I would say to Bromont is you need more lifts, because wow, is it ever crowded? So unfortunate that some of these awesome mountains are just a little bit too crowded. Resorts, mountains out there, if you're listening, the one thing that you can do is increase that lift capacity when you can. I mean, if you can even install a chair and only run it when it's busy, then that is all the better, right? Save a little bit of money, but use it when you need it. And trust me, I think it will pay back, as the word does get around when it's a little bit too busy at your resort. So I wanted to give a shout out to Quebec Snowboard as well, and the judges working with Quebec Snowboard. That event ran as smooth as butter. I'm going to give myself a little bit of a tap on the back, as well, as I was a volunteer at the start and calling in the riders for the judges. So thank you to all the volunteers. Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to Bromont for the event. And by the way, I want to say thank you to Max Parot as well for taking a picture with the Groms and inspiring them. We had a wonderful time. If you have any questions about myself, about snowboarding, please send us a DM on our Instagram at Kai and Ollie Shred, underscores between all of those words. And we will please also review our podcast on the listening app of your choice. And if you review the podcast, we will make an effort to choose one of those reviews and read it on the air. Once again, thank you for listening. Raise the bar and shred on.